go ahead and start with our announcement. The first thing is, as we said, you're being recorded, so please be aware of that. We also want to announce next month's event will be on March 16th, back at our normal time, 6 to 7:30. And that program we're really excited about over material selection, a guide to healthy, sustainable, and equitable specifications. And we have a great group of presenters for this one to discuss making our specifications more sustainable. This program is worth CEU credits, an hour and a half worth of CEU credits. So Laura has copied a link to a Google form into the chat. Please click on that and fill that out to make sure that you're getting your credits. Also, if you have questions, we have some time at the end of the program for questions. So please put any questions you have in the chat and we'll get to them after the program, or after the program ends and we start question time. Please feel free to unmute and ask your question. Okay, with all of those announcements, we'll kick this off. I'm Beth Piercy, and Laura Fatt and I are the co-chairs of Committee on the Environment. And Alan Rick will be presenting today. Alan is the founding principal and the chief design officer of MASS Design Group, whose mission is to research, build, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. MASS is the 2022 AIA Firm of the Year, and in 2017, Alan and MASS were awarded the National Design Award for Architecture. Alan is a member of the Forum of Young Global Leaders with the World Economic Forum, a community of over 800 men and women selected under the age of 40 who operate as a force for good to overcome barriers that elsewhere stand in the way of progress. The community is made up of leaders from all walks of life, from every region of the world, and from every stakeholder group in society. He is taught at the GSD and most recently at the Yale School of Architecture. He regularly speaks, writes, and creates films focused on the role of architecture in catalyzing social change. Chris Anderson, chief curator of TED, described his TED Talk as a different language about what architecture can aspire to be. He has a Bachelor of Arts from Colorado College and a Master of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So Alan, do you want to share your screen and get us started?
Yeah, sounds good. Does that seem to be working okay? Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be with y'all this cold winter evening, calling in from home in Cambridge. I'm going to give a talk that kind of gives you a very quick recap of kind of where MASS came from, and then really dive into one specific project in depth that I thought aligned with the kind of themes that y'all have been focusing on, and we'll look forward to having a discussion about it after that. Let's see if, okay. We'll see if my screen sharing works. Looks like there's already a little bit of a glitch there, but the MASS's story starts in the hills of Rwanda 15 years ago. After we met a doctor based here in Boston, Paul Farmer, who was one of the founders of an organization called Partners in Health that has really transformed the way we think about delivering care in the world over the last 30 years, particularly in poor communities in different parts of the world, originally in Haiti, that were trying to figure out how to treat diseases like tuberculosis, for example, and the challenges of reaching rural, distant places with that care. And they developed some pretty novel practices focused on using community health workers and really committing to what they called the preferential option for the poor, that for those that have been historically marginalized, we owe something better. This idea that now we often talk about as the idea of equity. And they went about kind of changing the perceptions of the affordability of doing that in many places. And in 2005, were invited by the government of Rwanda to start working there in helping them to rebuild the health infrastructure system that had been decimated during the genocide. And when we met them, they had already done a lot of infrastructure work, built a number of clinics and other facilities, but hadn't worked with a lot of architects. And in fact, said that where are the architects, like, to help us think through these issues? And of course, this has all become something we're much more acutely aware of in the last couple of years, the relationship of the built environment to the spread of airborne disease. But they were aware of this back then as well, having looked at outbreaks of tuberculosis and extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis, and seeing that in some cases, the actual source of outbreak was in hospitals and in clinics where they had poorly ventilated spaces. And so we kind of went down this rabbit hole working with these practitioners in global health to understand what were the challenges that they were facing, and to try and look for some opportunities. In the case of Rwanda, let me see if one of these is the climate, this kind of idyllic climate that is very moderate temperatures all year round. There's a couple of rainy seasons, but the temperature is more or less consistent. And so we looked at building a hospital on the top of a hill where it could have greatest access to prevailing breezes. And we built it as a campus of buildings that would use all open air circulation. So there's no hallways in the project. All the buildings are single loaded, so each building can have cross ventilation. We started looking at the ward designs themselves, looking at a kind of version of the Florence Nightingale style ward that has been replicated around the world, but with some specific changes, kind of inverting it so the beds face out, so you have larger fenestration, but also views to nature, which have been shown to improve recovery times. And then we're circulating air with large low velocity fans that you can't see in this image up into the upper part of the room, where it's treated with these UVGI light fixtures and can be exhausted through these louvers in the clerestory. So looking at these kind of hybrid conditions of both passive systems, but supplementing that with technology as well. But that's not really what I'm going to be focusing on tonight, but is kind of looking at the origins of mass and through the work in solving from a specific agenda of improving health outcomes. And there were a lot of ideas that went into that, but where we actually, I feel like, learned the most was in trying to get the hospital built, trying to actually translate those principles into something that could actually happen. And so we started working with the partners in health builders and engineers to think about what the process was going to look like and apply the methodology that Partners in Health brings to healthcare to the building process, seeing this as an opportunity to have economic impact in the region, seeing it as a way to have opportunities for training and education and invest in place. And one of the stories that we tell all the time is about the use of this volcanic stone. This material was not seen as something of value. It was a nuisance for all of the farmers in the area that have to remove it from the fields in order to farm, and literally piled up on the side of property and not seen as something with a lot of inherent value. And so we looked at how that could be used as a facade to privilege the craft of the assembly, and to take this thing that had kind of modest inherent value and turn it into something that would be perceived as having value. And then that story is in many ways an analog for the rest of the process, looking at each decision as an opportunity to do this. And it took a tremendous amount of iteration to figure out how to assemble this with masons that weren't accustomed to building this way, but really has become a kind of symbol of this project that has been replicated and evolved over time. This first project was just one of many that we've worked on in this one place over a decade of time. Once the hospital opened, it was very quickly at capacity, and they started looking at how they were going to expand it. But one of the other issues was figuring out how to staff it, how to bring doctors here. That eventually became a teaching hospital, so you have people training here as well. And the doctors are typically in the cities because there's very little, there's huge demand, but not that much supply. And so enticing them out to the rural areas became a kind of objective. And so one hypothesis was that we could build quality housing. And so what you see here is kind of two phases of that, but we went into what was our first design build project, creating these duplex units, building on a lot of the things we learned. These are using compressed earth blocks harvested on the site. Once we were done producing all the bricks, we turned the shop into a carpentry shop and made all of the roof structure and all of the furniture on site. Again, you see the same volcanic stone being used here. This was at the time a kind of radical idea that housing would be a critical piece of their infrastructure build out, but ended up being quite successful, and people really saw having that space as vital and something that enabled them to commit to longer term contracts at the hospital. And so they had us do a second phase of housing. This really focused more on the doctors and nurses and staff that were training. So these are 4-bedroom units that people are coming to stay at for shorter periods of time. They also shifted from just primary care into non-communicable diseases. And when they looked at deciding to build the first outpatient cancer center in the country, they located it here in this rural area. And we rehabilitated a old building on site, which is the kind of part of the building on the left you see, and then expanded with a space for infusion on the right. Again, kind of exploring many of these same principles, looking at leveraging the access to nature, light and air, and creating a sense of community for people that are often traveling long distances in order to get infusion therapy. That ended up being one of the challenges that people faced, was just the cost of actually coming to the site. And so they decided they needed to provide accommodations for them, much like a kind of Ronald McDonald House model, for those of you that are familiar with that. So building a kind of dormitory, not only for patients, but also for the family members that often accompany them. And then the last project on this site to be built is a university, the University of Global Health Equity. This was a project that was designed with Shepley Bulfinch, who led the academic buildings, mastered the housing and landscape and CA, and was part of Partners in Health's agenda to really create a new kind of generation of global health practitioners that are coming from all over the world to study in this part of northern Rwanda. So you can see the university on the right, you see the doctor's housing and the hospital on the left, on the other side of the valley. So this is the kind of origin story of our work, is working in one specific place and really developing a kind of philosophy of practice that is based on trying to maximize the locally available resources to have the greatest positive social and environmental impact possible. It turned into a firm over the years. Our mission is to build, research, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. And, you know, it has evolved a lot. And we often like to say our first, largest, and longest running project is the design of our practice. Today, we have somewhere between 150 and 2,000 people, depending on who you're counting. We have in Rwanda, which is still our largest office, a completely multidisciplinary team of architects, engineers, landscape architects. We have a construction company. That's why there's the big difference in numbers, that has been working across 2 projects and itself has over 1,500 people on staff. We're a nonprofit, so pretty different approach. And that has really been driven by the idea of trying to reach new types of clients and communities that might not have access to architecture, and to be able to provide them some of the early seed funding to bring projects to fruition, to create the early visioning and design that can unlock capital that then enables them to pay for architecture, engineering, and construction. Sorry, I'm having some issue with my slides, but we're today, this is a bit of an outdated photo, but we have 25 principals and senior directors that run the practice and ultimately make decisions about how we're allocating that philanthropic capital to go towards those seed investments that have allowed us to work with over 100 different organizations in 20 countries around the world. Our 2 largest offices are still Kigali, by far the biggest, and then Boston, and then we have satellites in Poughkeepsie and Santa Fe, and team members spread out all over the place, particularly in the last couple of years as people have shifted to more remote work. A lot of the work remains in sub-Saharan Africa, but in the last 5 years, really an expansion of work into North America and further afield. Tonight, I wanted to really focus on one project back in Rwanda that I think really looks at the issue of the environment in perhaps the most comprehensive way of anything we've had the opportunity to work on. But I want to kind of start by setting the table of some of the issues that we've thought about. This isn't a different part of the country than the hospital. The hospital's up in a high altitude near these volcanoes, incredibly lush area. This is in an area south of the capital of Rwanda. It's more arid, gets hotter, a little less plentiful, and where we're really looking at the issue of agriculture. But I think first, I want to kind of talk a little bit of a story about the ecology of this place. And it begins, I think, with a kind of anecdote that can describe some of the issues that we're faced with through the lens of this gray-crowned crane. Gray-crowned crane is a majestic bird, the national bird of Uganda. It's native to this area, and it depends on a very kind of specific ecosystem. It roosts in these acacia trees that you see here, and the acacias, often you see them kind of in the savanna like you see here, and they're really prized because they offer shade for certain types of grasses that grow here. So even the herders like to have them, but also the roots actually fix nitrogen into the soil, creating richer soil beneath. The gray-crowned crane also forages for food on the banks of the lakes that are here that ultimately feed the Nile. These wetlands are, of course, rich with biodiversity, but also serve as a filter and an important part of maintaining the quality of water in the system here. you see a kind of aerial view of these papyrus groves. And this is all positioned within a radical change in the country of Rwanda. So in 1965, you had 4.6 million people, and most of the land was forest and grassland. By 2000, the population has doubled, and you're seeing significant transformation of land use into agricultural production. By 2019, it's 12.8 million people, and 80% of the land is now focused on food production. This is only going to continue. The population is expected to double again by 2050. You have a population that's already about 20% food insecure. So here you have this pending crisis where we have to figure out how to produce more food more sustainably to support this population. And yet we're looking at also having to cope with some of the negative impacts of this type of land use change. So you're seeing clearing of the forests and grasslands to make way for farming and grazing. That's leading to erosion. You've removed a lot of the wetlands to give livestock access to water. So you're having more of that erosion find its way into the lakes, having soil degradation. Because of this, the great crowned crane has left in these areas. The cranes and other birds are helping keep in balance insect populations. So then you're having more infestations of crops. You're also seeing overarching climate change, shifting the malarial line up in elevation. So you're having increased incidence of malaria due to prevalence of mosquito population. So here you see this kind of vicious cycle of kind of short-term land use focused on food production, actually having long-term negative impacts on overall population health. And so what we see is a kind of siloed approach to land use, when what we need is an intertwined approach that holds in mind human, animal, and ecologic systems, and understanding that they're intertwined. And people talk about this as a kind of One Health strategy that looks at how we can leverage those interrelationships to address issues like food crises, and that we've seen that it is possible with approaches like agroforestry to actually improve overall yield production while being able to preserve biodiversity. So you're looking at a kind of movement away from the typical monocrop production that we're familiar with, that you see as the giant crop circles that if you're flying over the Midwest, towards a One Health strategy that is looking at more interweaving of native species in with food production. So this is a site that we're working on, and here you can see this land use in stark plain sight. You see in the foreground the transformation into these smallholder farms, and away from what is one of the largest remaining patches of intact savanna woodland left in the country outside of a national park. We went in and with an ecologist actually created a map of the whole taxonomy of the ecology of this area. The 2 endangered bird species there. You had large cats, wild cats that aren't seen many other places, but incredibly rich number of flora and fauna species. And then we started to look at this over a long time horizon. What would it take to bring back the great crowned crane and other types of apex species that have migrated away as the land use has changed, and really focusing on kind of introducing some of these establishment crops that could help set the table for the reintroduction of other species over time. And then that really plays out into the overall master planning of this site, where we're looking at balancing an array of decisions while also building the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture. So trying to actually show that agricultural food production can coexist alongside conservation efforts. So it starts with preserving the remnants of Anna forest and actually removing roads that were cutting through it to try and maintain the size of that patch. Then also looking at setbacks from the lakes to keep the papyrus wetland intact. And then looking through the rest of the site to understand what is optimized based on soil conditions for food production, for grazing, for other components. We looked at a kind of a pedagogical approach to an immersive experience where the first year students live on smallholder farms. So in groups of 21 students, they each there's 4 groups of 21 first-year students. They live in these dorms and they farm the area around them and have to figure out how to sustainably manage that. And they can bring in some livestock. They can focus on crop growth. They're actually looking at how that then is utilized for campus dining. So on one kind of end of the spectrum is the kind of student life immersive experience. We have the first year students, second and third year students are in this kind of figure 8 building, faculty housing. And then I'm going to zoom into that first year farm a little bit. So it really, we're looking at how can we be responsive to the place. Again, looking at the resources that are available. Some very simple, straightforward, passive moves. The buildings are oriented due east-west. This is very close to the equator. So north and south exposure are more or less the same at different times of year. So we have these butterfly roofs that we can use to collect rainwater with large eaves for shading those facades and really minimizing the kind of east and west exposure. The buildings are built with earthen construction, so a mix of compressed earth blocks and rammed earth for the wall systems. We're looking at timber structure for all the roof systems, which is actually pretty rare in Rwanda. Typically, you're looking at concrete or steel, that's all imported, and obviously you might think there's a kind of inherent friction with deforestation and the use of timber systems, but we've did a lot of work looking at the different supply chains and found some of the kind of emerging sustainable forestry practices that were happening. A company that was coming out looking at sustainably harvesting within the edges of one of the national parks, and then looking outside of Rwanda in places like Tanzania for tree farms and other things to understand what exact timber species we wanted to use for the different types of systems that were being developed. We worked with a local terracotta manufacturer that was using agricultural waste to fire the products for the roof tiles. So this project is still under construction, wrapping up, but I do have some photos sprinkled in here. Some are older than others, but you can get a sense of these first year farms. You see the faculty housing in the back, the second and third year dorm, which has subsequently been finished, but is under construction in this image, and the central pedestrian spine down the middle of the campus. Here you see the kind of entrance into the first year farm, the rammed earth walls, earth plaster finished to all the buildings. And then on the other end of the campus, we have the kind of core academic buildings that we call the enterprises that are focused on different specialties within the agricultural system. So you're looking at dairy, for example, tree crops, row crops. We have poultry, swine, ruminants, all these different components of the education that each have buildings. So we wanted to do something a little different in the massing and way these buildings sit on the site. They're actually run north-south so that they can be these kind of stitches that reach out into the landscape where the actual work is happening. So for dairy, for example, they reach out into the grazing land, but ultimately they all plug back into that central spine, which is where the kind of like end of the chain happens. So you've got your cows out grazing in the field, then you have your milking parlor, and then you have an area where you're making value-added products, yogurt, for example, or something like that. And that is the component that then plugs into the spine. So that was kind of driven by a location on site. And then the design had to adapt based on the solar exposure. So in this case, we're using the sawtooth design. So we're keeping most of the glazing on the north or south side, and then keeping the east and west facades with really high dense thermal mass without a lot of openings in them. So again, a lot of kind of analysis into trying to maintain comfort in a fairly hot zone, all kind of passively ventilated systems, and a lot of work into that, working with our frequent collaborators at TransSolar into the environmental design. These are some renderings of what those enterprises look like. And then this is a kind of still under construction image that you can see this. These photos are all somewhat old. The first phase opened a year and a half ago. So the second year students are in their second semester. So it's opening in phases and will be finished in the coming months. But just a few photos of those buildings here. You get a good look at some of the terracotta tiles, both as a roof and a facade in this case, that we developed a custom mold to create this kind of more flat blocking panel. There's a few kind of more social buildings that are differentiated in terms of the design. You have the campus center, which is the kind of heart of the campus, the dining hall, the literal farm to table experience, if you will. And but very similar principles being deployed here. In this case, it's 2 stories, it's sloping down the site. So you emerge into the dining hall space that's a double height open air pavilion, which this is what it looks like today. Sorry, my slides are being very glitchy. So here's the rendering, here's the reality. This is a kind of snapshot photo, but has been in operation since the fall. Then we have the second and third year dorm here, this figure 8 building. You have a kind of men's and women's side of the building. At this point in the curriculum, students have started to specialize into the different enterprise areas and looking at creating space for them to come together. So we have these 2 courtyard spaces, as well as a kind of shared lounge space at the intersection there. And here you see in the renderings this portrait series of some artists that we've been collaborating with, who had this series of images called Strong Women, but I thought was like a really good kind of representation of the mission of the school, which is to elevate agriculture as a career. That in Rwanda, you rank your major as a way of going into the admissions process. And agriculture has historically been kind of seen as a kind of poor person's avocation, and they're really trying to shift this to be about innovation and entrepreneurship, and to kind of elevate the status of the farmer. So we've been working with some of these artists in terms of ways to kind of represent that. We, on this project, really dug into so many different scales, including the furniture. We've manufactured all of the furniture and finishes for the project. This is just one of those examples. We did a lot of the tile work, working with this ceramicist named Walaris, who often was kind of described as the godfather of ceramics in the country, working out of his house in a kind of remote village, developing these glazes using a lot of local materials. I already kind of talked a little bit about the terracotta tiles, but we actually went through and did all of this embodied carbon analysis. We don't, like, these things are all more or less handmade, so we're not getting these types of coefficients from manufacturers. We're having to kind of construct the data ourselves. So going back and, this is the constituent components of a brick. So actually understanding where all the materials are coming from that are going into a brick, and calculating the embodied carbon of that. Wood, we're having to actually understand all the different wood species that are available, what can be sustainably harvested, but also looking at it through its ecological value. What are the things that we want to promote in reforestation? Much of the country in dealing with deforestation has looked at using eucalyptus as a reforestation strategy, which is is not a native species here. It requires a lot of water, grows fast. That's why it's desired. But we started looking at, what are the kind of native species that could both contribute to rebuilding the biodiversity of the place, but also would have uses in the marketplace. So whether it's things that would be good for structure or for furniture production. So a lot of research into actually testing the different species and looking at where we find them. Teophile is our master carpenter that you see on the left, who kind of has developed this whole network of kind of more small scale procurement. Because a lot of the things that we were doing on site were kind of more novel building methods for the area, we're having to do a lot of the testing on site. So you see our structural team doing some load testing on the left. We're not able to get graded lumber from mills, so we're having to grade things ourselves. We're having to go to the mills and measure moisture content, and do a lot more kind of legwork to kind of understand what we're going to be able to use, and then iterate and test when things don't behave the way the models suggest they will on site and adapt. We've developed a kind of network of over 85 different cooperatives that have worked with us on the furniture production. So ranging across carpenters, but a lot of work with fiber and finding different weavers, you see some banana fibers here, working with sisal, working with papyrus to make different products. That here you see some of those things getting dyed. And here you see some of the furniture products. So making everything from the lounge furniture to the rugs, to all the tables and these pendant light fixtures that have these woven shades on them. So looking at this through a kind of range of scales, actually mapping our procurement where, like 95% of the material by mass is coming from within a very small geographic zone. There are high embodied carbon, long transportation things like the solar array and the wastewater treatment plant. These things are coming in, but some of the kind of fundamental decisions that were made around using stone foundations instead of reinforced concrete, the earthen walls, wood roof systems instead of concrete or steel, are allowing us to kind of reduce the embodied carbon relative to kind of global standard institutional buildings. And that's probably all kind of familiar topics or content for y'all. But the kind of last thing I'll mention is, on this idea of actually the regenerative piece. So, no matter how much we're able to do in terms of more efficiently build with low embodied carbon materials, everything is off grid here, energy production, with the water system, wastewater treatment, it's still inherently extractive. And so we have to look at the landscape strategies as ways to actually get to a climate positive solution. In this case, we have a lot of land area, so that's a huge resource to look at it from a sequestration standpoint. So we're looking at the landscape strategy, reforestation strategies, and soil as opportunities for sequestration, where actually our projections have improved a little bit from this to think that we would get to carbon neutral in under a decade. And we've been working with Atelier 10 to help us do some of that analysis, particularly around understanding more about carbon sequestration in soil. So that's my whirlwind presentation of this one project. So can jump into discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was, well, I found it fascinating, and I really appreciate it. As we've said, if anyone would like to unmute and ask a question directly, please feel free to do so now, or raise your hand. If I don't see anyone, Laura, I think you just came off mute. I don't know if you have a question.
Sure. I'm wondering how you drain the sawtooth roots. I realize you don't have ice and snow to contend with, but how do you actually collect the water and not have it, rot out the wall that it's up against?
There's really big gutters at the valley there that are, collecting it, going to downspouts on each side. So you just have crickets and then.
Is that water then collected? I'm assuming there's a reuse of water, even though it's a very moist climate for in that lower region.
Yeah, they are able to use water for irrigation and gray water use. This was a big part of some of the early analysis that ARIP did on the kind of civil works part of the project, was to make sure to kind of understand the overall water demands, which are significant because they are doing a lot of irrigation. This is actually a pretty dry part of the country, and to make sure that while we're using the lake as a source, that it's maintaining water balance and not actually depleting the lake.
Jefferson, did you have a question?
I did. First of all, thanks. Really wonderfully inspiring work, and great to see it celebrated here in this forum. The question I have is, to what degree are some of the lessons that you're able to learn from this project in Rwanda, does any of it inform or translate to your other work, whether in Poughkeepsie or Haiti or otherwise? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think, this project is so extreme in terms of like the opportunity to manage the process from all the way throughout the supply chain. So obviously can be more challenging in the US context, but I think, these issues are all replicable in terms of the way we think about the ambition of the process, but also some of the goals. So we're working on multiple food systems related projects in the Hudson Valley, out in California, that all, I think, want to see similar things. How do we bring, often we kind of talk about the values of the slow food movement, and how does that translate into the built environment. And in these types of projects, they're quite intertwined, where in one of the projects in the Hudson Valley, we're literally looking at growing some of the building material on site for use in the construction. So it's not nothing that novel, straw bale construction, but what if we could actually produce it ourselves?
I think that actually feeds into segues well into the question I had is, having, you said that if you count your construction crews as part of your firm or part of your corporation, then is that, are you learning, is that a back and forth? If you're growing on site, if you're, using that resource, does that work in a way that, many of us as designers don't have? We don't have that direct connection to the construction. Does that allow you that more, I guess, granular understanding of the materials that are on site there?
Definitely. I mean, I think, like I showed, we're having to do a lot of the kind of prototyping and testing and refinement to these things, which would be, probably close to impossible in a kind of more regulated context. So, but I think we really feel like the education of working this way and what we learned, working on Butaro and through those early projects kind of has caused us to kind of think about material selection from a different vantage point that isn't kind of picking it out of a catalog, but understanding it through its lens of impact, and that it can be a kind of formal driver to think about what are the materials we want to use based on their provenance. So I think, we have a team at Mass that's focused on what we call building performance and provenance, and that it's both looking at the kind of performance from like an efficiency standpoint of maximizing passive systems, but also looking at where it comes from and what are the kind of social environmental implications of those choices. And I think there's so much work being done on that now, and it's a matter of making those the impacts of those choices and more legible to people, that they can better appreciate the kind of impact of decision X versus decision Y, both from a cost, which is the way most people look at it, from a performance life cycle cost perspective, but also from a social cost and a carbon cost.
Is that what's driving, when you're doing these kind of LCA analysis of the brick that you showed, or which are incredible, and especially given the kind of, we all use these resources from different programs, and you're, creating it from scratch. Is the driver to do that, an internal one, or is that coming from, the folks you're working with, or the clients or construction teams, or?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I wish I could say it was being driven by the clients. I wouldn't say that's the case. I mean, I think, maybe I want to be an optimist, I guess, but I think, everybody likes these as ideas. It's the rub is when it costs more or is harder. And so I think, a big part of this work is trying to figure out, are there things that we can make the case? And we have to look at that idea of cost holistically and look at the externalities beyond the kind of like purchase price of it as a commodity, but a much bigger view of it. And I think, in the context of a place like Rwanda, some of the cost factors are, inverted from somewhere like the US. Labor costs are low, material costs are high there. Often when we started doing this work, everyone was like, are you looking at prefab? And it's like, well, prefab is a solution for high labor costs. And like, that's not what we have here. We want like high labor like processes, because it keeps the money locally, more jobs. And that has allowed us to kind of, earthen construction is slow and time consuming, and but can be affordable. But even that has gone through so many iterations, and some surprising things have taken it into the kind of realm of unaffordability. So up in Butaro, where we also did some CSEB construction, we didn't have like site access to water. And so the cost of water ended up being the kind of most expensive piece of the ingredients, and actually made it quite expensive. Literally having people, by hand ferrying water up from a spring. So a lot of trial and error is going into this, but I think, as we get more kind of sophisticated and there's more focus on the kind of provenance side of this, I think there will be more awareness. And I think, I hope that it will shift to being a kind of either by regulation or by social pressure, or but it will eventually become a kind of market expectation that you're able to meet some of these goals. And I think, there's so much more interest in embodied carbon now. I think what still feels like the kind of least clear part of the equation is the regenerative side. Like what are the ways that we can actually offset? And I think everybody's gotten really focused on like embodied carbon within architecture, I would say. But the kind of surprising thing is that like the trade-offs are not as big as I think we would like to think they are. Like if you look at it relative to a cost of an offset, like it's affordable to offset. So the problem is it's like very hard to tell like what are the actual viable offsets. There's so few carbon like kind of, and this I'm outside of my expertise, but I'm saying this is like what I feel like is what we need is like greater guidance on what offsets we should be advocating for. But I think what I would like to see is a kind of push for a budget set aside, a requirement that's looking at offsets. And we think that it could be as low as like 1% of the project budget. And like if you're just making, it's not like you have to like look at every single decision through the embodied carbon lens. I think if we believe if we start making some basic principled decisions that are that think about that, then and reduce the kind of operating energy, lower embodied carbon things, that the biggest shift is really going to be on figuring out how to inset and offset. And this project is rare that we can just plant a lot of things and actually do it ourselves. But the more challenging thing is to say, well, I'm building in Boston, I can't plant thousands of trees, but maybe I can persuade my client to set aside 1%. But what do you do with it? And there's this is the kind of thing that we're trying to dig into now, is like what are the kind of validated models that aren't just looking, and there's a lot of debate around this, and like I said, I'm not the expert, but the kind of tension is that most of the offsets are around reduction of carbon. They're not actually in carbon capture. So they're good, but they're not removing carbon. And that's the kind of North Star, is to figure out how to actually be able to diminish the carbon like that graph I showed, and not just make the case through theoretical reductions. Probably there's somebody on here that knows a lot more about this than me, so I'm just on my soapbox.
Would anyone else, let's see, Christopher, it looks like you came off mute. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Mine sort of tags on to Jefferson's, I think, a little bit, which you talked about the evolution of your company and how it seems like there, at least my understanding of the history is a lot of the work was in sub-Saharan Africa, and now there's a bit more work elsewhere in the world. And I imagine you have like a direction for some of that too, or perhaps it's more organic. And I guess I'd be curious whether there is like a model that you're setting aside, or if it's I'm sure it's revisited frequently, or how you sort of envision the evolution of your firm.
Yeah.
I'm super curious, because it does seem like while there's a lot of lessons that you can learn from the work that you've done in other parts of the country, and I like really appreciate the way that you talk about them. It's very different, I think, to do work here, like as you've mentioned, and I'm curious what your thoughts are more broadly in terms of the arc of Maps.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it's in constant iteration. So we've been around, close to 15 years, and we're on what we call our version 7.0 of like the org. And I think, the firm of the year thing for us is like maybe a kind of like validation of that first concept because nobody was talking about the social impact. I mean, it was not nobody. It was on the fringes. It was like a different, separate conference, for that. And like within academia, it was like out there on the fringes. And now it's like, the theme of the AIA conferences is on these issues. So now, we're like, what do we want to do in terms of shifting 10 years from now? And I think, the reason we've kind of shifted to working in the US is that often we would kind of talk about this and people are like, well, we can never do that here. That maybe that can happen in Rwanda. And I think, we don't believe that. And I think the other thing is that, the real impact is not in, like we built like a number of small primary schools. We're proud of them. They're good. We think they have a positive impact in the world, but the impact of the building sector in the private sector is infinitely bigger. And like, this can't just be a kind of like altruistic principle that you only embrace when, you're doing like clearly public service work. Like it has to be woven into, the entire industry. And so I think we're a nonprofit, we're focused on public work, but that's just like our business model. Like the same values, like we want to see in all the projects. And this isn't about shifting what architects want. Like all the architects already want this. It's like getting the marketplace to demand it. And so we got to get, proof of concept type projects out there that can champion these things. And there's, lots of them now. And I think we are seeing a shift. It's just, is it happening fast enough?
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
To that, I think to that end, what, not to give away your secret sauce, I mean, you all are obviously doing, creating a model for your firm and for your work, but is there something that you would see for, normative firms out there that we should be championing or pushing forward, materiality or what is the thing that we should be focusing our lens on that we aren't?
I mean, I think it's really hard to do this within the thin margins of our business model of what we do in architects. And so, our secret sauce, I guess, as being a nonprofit is that we said, well, like the market doesn't value this and can't afford it. And so we're going to find a different way to fund part of that work. And so we kind of talk about the like underfunded front end and back end, the kind of deep immersion in place to both understand like what the design needs to be, but also to uncover the resources is not something that's funded, especially in the social sector. Pre-design, I mean, like architecture is not afforded, let alone kind of pre-design. So, we're able to bring philanthropy to help fund that. And then on the back end, doing like some of this R&D that is just like not really affordable within the kind of typical margins that we operate within, and otherwise it's kind of relegated to academia. And, we're able to get grants to help build out these, what we think of as kind of emerging markets. So, we have what we call our labs, which are kind of like research-based focus areas. So our Fringe Cities Lab is looking at the small American city in kind of post-industrial towns like Poughkeepsie. Our Sustainable Native Communities Lab is based in Santa Fe and works with indigenous communities across North America. We have our Food Systems Lab looking at topics that I talked about today about the kind of overlap of agriculture and the built environment. We have our Public Memory and Memorial Lab that's based here in Boston, working on things like the National Memorial to Peace and Justice in Alabama. And we're just going into construction on the Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King Memorial on the Common, among many other projects that they're digging into. But I think what can other firms do? I honestly, I think it's mostly about trying to kind of dive into helping owners understand like the trade-offs, and to not just look at the kind of first cost of these things. And I think, showing them, giving them options and kind of looking at some of the trade-offs is an area for work. I think kind of investment in the kind of places that we're working, that often kind of becomes these kind of tokenized community meeting things, I think is a big part of our creed, I guess. I don't know. Those are the kind of core things.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's a lot. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm monopolizing the questions. If anyone else would like to ask a question, feel free to jump on or put it in the chat.
So I just want to say that for anyone who joined late, I copied the link to the Google Forms to get AIA credits in the chat. So don't forget to fill that out.
Any other questions? Anyone else?
Yes, this is Francisca Amaker. Hi. This is really wonderful work. I congratulate you. I was wondering whether there have been any copycats in Rwanda who kind of see the wisdom of your approach. And also the second question, how did you cross the cultural barriers that are inevitably, white guy in Rwanda bringing such radical changes?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, those are both kind of, the second one is a question I get a lot. The first one is interesting, so I'll take the second one first. Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously was just a fact. I mean, we were architecture students coming from the US working in Rwanda. In 2007, there were fewer than 10 architects in the country. There was no school of architecture, and a lot of the kind of colonial era buildings were demolished after the war. And so you had some kind of vernacular or like historic kind of building traditions, like the King's Hut that you could see in Nyanza and other kind of vernacular practices, but otherwise a kind of like adoption of a kind of like international approach to building that was really prioritizing, concrete block and steel and glass, and not a particularly like contextually responsive palette. And but I think, you know, a real hunger for innovation in the country. I mean, they're doing a lot of innovative things. So I think in some ways, like more of an appetite than we have in the US to try new things. So I mean, I think we'd like to think it's kind of like inherently contextual because it's made of stuff from there. So the materials kind of bring a certain kind of contextual piece to it. But our, you know, our team has changed a lot. So now the office is majority Rwandese, has Rwandese leadership. You know, Christian Benimana is the senior principal managing director of that office. And you know, there was a university program that was created. A number of Mass folks have taught there. We're part of the original curriculum. You know, Sierra Bainbridge, one of our senior principals, was the first head of the architecture department, helped create the curriculum. Christian, who I just mentioned, you know, went to Tongji University, so he got a scholarship, was like dropped in Shanghai, learned Mandarin, went to school in China, then came back. So he joined that faculty and then met Mass. And that's actually, I mean, it's a crazy, amazing story, but that's the story of any architect in Rwanda that's over the age of 30, basically, is that they had to go abroad. So now we've been able to really change the kind of demographics of the office, not only because now we've had several classes of graduating students, but also the kind of multidisciplinary expansion. So I think we probably have like 40 engineers based there. So engineering is much more kind of prevalent. So out of the 40 engineers, I think maybe like 4 of them are foreign. Obviously on the construction side, we've out of the 2,000 people, there's 3 Americans, or maybe 2 Americans and 1 Canadian. So it's really shifted a lot and is now, but that has been one of the priorities for us and for that team to be kind of primarily African nationals leading that work. So, but I think now, our biggest project is in Bangladesh. So, but is being run out of Kigali. So we're like exporting the kind of Rwandan design now, I guess. The second question, I don't know that, I mean, I don't know that I would say there's anything that's like a copycat. I mean, we all copy each other all the time. But I think what we see is there's a market now. I mean, there were no architects. Now there's architects. You got, and there's famous architects. Norman Foster's in Rwanda, Adjay's in Rwanda, Renzo Piano's working in Uganda. So, and that's great. I mean, I think that means it's working. Now there's like a greater value placed on architecture. And so I think we see like that as like a positive sign that there's like a more thriving kind of marketplace for architecture and design services.
That's encouraging, I think.
That's incredible. It's hard. I'm sure you've thought long and hard about this numbers of times, how much is driven by what you all have done and how much would have naturally gone through, but it's still, obviously you have such a hand in those changes. Seeing that, we are getting 6:15. I know we have another 15 minutes if everyone would like to stay on and keep asking questions, but I don't want to speak for Alan. If you go, but if there are any other questions.
I just want to say thanks. It was really great to be able to hear you present and have such like intimate conversation with you. It feels like such a pleasure for us. So I just want to say thank you for that. I do have to head off, but I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for having me.
I know we very much appreciate it. This is a great conversation, and I do appreciate, you know, the presentation was amazing, and you know, just your time speaking with us is great. We appreciate the BSA for making this possible as well. And as we said in the beginning, next month we have another great talk, this one a little more techie. We're going to be talking about the healthy building materials, specifically, you know, when we're putting together our materials and specification thinking. So it does feed off this. So please, everyone, come back and hear from Ann Hicks Harney, Lisa Goodwin Robbins, and Charlie Stevenson. They'll be a great panel speaking. Thank you, Alan. We really appreciate this, and appreciate everyone joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.